Like, did I just waste 2 years of my life? I think we provided value, but ultimately it was a pretty humbling experience as a product person, right? Where by providing that customizability, that kind of bespokeness, I probably ended up just delaying something that was inevitable.
Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at Mang-Git@useanvil.com. That's Manggit@useanvil.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Build First Buy podcast. I am your host, Mang-Git, co-founder and CEO of Anvil, the fastest way to build software for paperwork. And today I have Scott Woody on the show. He is a CEO of Metronome. Hey, Scott.
Hey, how's it going? How's your day?
Going great. It's the day after Halloween, so we got all the spookiness out.
Yeah.
But maybe to start, would love for you to introduce yourself to the audience, a little bit about your background, about Metronome, just to set the stage for people tuning in.
Awesome. Good to have a chance to chat. So Metronome, high level, I like to tell the Metronome story starting from my time at Dropbox, and I'll just go through that quick since that's how we know each other. But basically, at Dropbox, I ran growth and monetization. My team's job was to grow the business at the maximum possible rate. And so Metronome is the system that's designed to help do that. And so specifically what we do is we automate all of the pricing and packaging and the billing workflows. And we solve three core problems for our customers. First, we make it trivial for you to spin up and launch any new pricing model in a drop of a hat with no code in minutes. Second thing we do is we really make the billing system work for your own customers. So we've invested a lot in product features that kind of pull billing data out of the billing system and present them back to your customers, things like cost controls, cost explorers, etc. Third thing we do is we make that data continuously available to your internal teams so that they can make better strategic decisions. So customers use Metronome to optimize their COGS, do things like revenue recognition, and also do revenue forecasting. So that's ultimately what we do. We obviously are lucky to work with some great customers like OpenAI and Databricks and NVIDIA. And yeah, the next couple years are going to be continuing on that journey. So I'm excited to continue on that path. Even it's been a bit of a whirlwind.
Awesome. Maybe a little bit about yourself, Scott. I know this is not your first rodeo. You've done the startup rodeo before, and you've been at a high growth startup. Would love for you to share a little bit of that with the audience.
Yeah. So I started in Silicon Valley in 2010-ish when I started my own company. Actually, it was a applicant tracking system. If you're familiar with Lever or Greenhouse, we actually almost merged with Lever when both companies were three people big, and that was a fun dalliance. But then ultimately, I got the opportunity to join Dropbox, and I was extremely excited about working at one of the premier engineering companies on earth. I'd never really been a fully trained software engineer, so I figured I would learn from the best. And I spent about 6.5 years there working on growth and monetization at the end, and then decided to start Metronome. And originally I was the CTO, moved into the CEO seat about 6-8 months ago, and have been enjoying it and trying to hold on as this thing continues to grow.
I didn't realize that you weren't a CS major. Or you didn't properly train, quote unquote, as a software engineer. And I would say myself, I'm the same way. I never really properly trained as a computer science person. And during my time at Dropbox, I definitely had imposter syndrome. There are these people that were so amazingly smart, and you would never be able to keep up with them in terms of technical acumen. I don't know if that's how you felt as well, but that was certainly how I
Oh
felt
my
when I was
God.
there.
I literally, when they made an offer, it was very funny. Since you interviewed, you probably got the same thing, but there was basically, I don't know if you knew Brian Smith there, but basically he was one of my interviewers, and he basically gave me a problem, which was like design, like Dropbox wants to build an address book for an address application. And he's designed the technical architecture for it. I started to do it, and then I paused and I was just like, wait, can I ask some questions? And he's sure. And why are we building this? This seems like a terrible use of time. And then basically we spent the entire hour arguing about how stupid of a product it was to build. And so at the end of that, I was like, yeah, there's no way in hell I got this job. And so I went home and then I found out that I got a job offer and I'm like, holy crap. I don't know who I tricked, but I signed that offer. I probably signed that in like record time. There's no way in hell I belong at this company. And I do not deserve to be here, but I'm going to jump in and learn along the way. And honestly, probably the best decision I made in my career for sure.
Yeah, it was definitely felt like a golden ticket. My experience personally was in 2011 when I was leaving Cisco. I actually applied to Dropbox, and I did not make it past the HR phone screen. I got a call, had a 15-minute chat, and they're like, "Yep, thanks, no thank you." And then probably 3 years later or so, the company that I was working at, Loom, not the video sharing one, but the photo sharing one, got
Mm.
acquired, and that's how I ended up at Dropbox. But I never actually had an interview, Scott. That's
Oh,
the funny thing.
wow.
We our
Humble brag.
CEO no, our CEO messed up the times and we showed up too late. So my interview was sitting with a bunch of other engineers in the tuck shop, which is the cafeteria at Dropbox, and that was it. So
Oh my God. So good.
circumstances.
So
I
good.
know. Uh, but that definitely fed into the imposter syndrome, I would say, of my
Yeah.
time there. But it was
Same.
definitely a very fun time. Maybe let's transition a little bit into the meat of today's conversation. Would love to hear about a time where you personally experienced, or maybe you were on the other side of a build versus buy conversation.
Mhm.
And I know there's lots of stories about this from within Dropbox or maybe even Metronome. I'm sure this is probably a big headwind you come up against, but
Yeah.
would love to hear the backdrop of the story and how you went through the decision making process to ultimately end up where you guys decided to end up.
Yeah. Does it have to be, do you want it to be a technical example or something more sassy? Because I have a sass in the SaaS sense.
Yeah, yeah. Whatever you want, and you can
Well,
throw as much sass into it as you want
okay,
as well.
I'm gonna go super personal. Okay. So basically I mentioned that I started a applicant tracking system. Ironically, when Dropbox acquired that, kind of as like a talent acquisition, but at the time they were trying to differentiate based on the talent that they brought in. And so it was one of these things where it was the heyday of talent acquisitions. And so they're like, let's just productize this thing that you built. So you built this applicant tracking system. Let's actually turn it into an internal product. And so I don't know if you ever experienced Gateway at
Yep.
Dropbox, but the first 2 years, that was what I worked on. It was basically taking our product and making it Dropbox centric. And so it was basically a home built applicant tracking system for Dropbox. And what I would say is it was obviously it was a build, obviously. But at a certain point, like 2 years in, we basically had to come up with this in particular for me. I felt I'd taken that as far as I wanted to go with it. And there was a lot of really exciting opportunities internal at Dropbox, including this monetization one. And I was like, I think personally I need to move on to go do something else. I think there's some really
Mhm.
big, interesting engineering challenges. And so I made the decision to step away from Gateway. And while that was sad for me personally, it was obviously the right decision. And then we had to make a decision. Do we continue to invest in this thing or do we go
Mhm.
purchase a third party piece of software? And so a lot of the conversations at first were like, there's a lot of the system works, it's already working at really high scale. It's much more customized to the ways that Dropbox worked.
Mhm.
But obviously, the maintainability of it is I was going to leave. They're like, who the hell is going to maintain this thing? And it was one of those hard conversations where whatever we purchase, whatever we replace it with, is going to be less of a white glove fit. But
Yeah.
obviously, it's going to be a much more sustainable long term thing. And so that kicked off a really intense, I would say, 3 month evaluation of
Mhm.
alternatives, the kind of short circuiting the answer, and we can definitely dive into details, but basically ultimately ended up moving to making a recommendation to move to lever and then ultimately move to greenhouse. And so for many reasons that were both political and non, and happy to go into the details, but basically it was a very interesting, long, personally painful, but also the right decision for the business. And yeah, it was a fun experience for me, but happy to dive into whatever part of that is interesting to you.
Yeah, maybe before we dive in, just one comment here on generally speaking, smart, talented, curious people. I feel we, you know, a good engineer wants to build something in a way that they can then hand off to somebody and go work on something else. And I feel that's definitely a little bit of what you pointed to there, which is you had worked on this internal applicant tracking system for quite some time, but it was time for you to move to something else. And there was something you wanted to explore and grow in another direction. And that process of handing your baby off to somebody else and moving and figuring out being uncomfortable again was probably maybe drove part of just the difficult decisioning process and
It,
moving off. Yeah.
it definitely, I had hired a team to work on it, and
Hmm.
I'd spent years working on it. And I knew by leaving that probably it was meant that this would be sunsetted. And so it was weirdly emotional. It's not like the saddest thing in the world, but it was, you invest a lot, but you ultimately got to prioritize what's best for the business. And then I also had this realization that, look, if I or my team are the linchpins holding this thing together, then is it
Yeah.
really doing its job for the business? Is it really, truly the right thing for this company? Because it's ultimately is a huge risk, right? What if
Yeah.
we left or got hit by a bus? What would happen? Would we still be able to hire and recruit? And it felt, the other thing that was really hard about it was that recruiting talent to work on these kind of internal builds
Hmm.
is really hard. It was really
Yeah.
easy to recruit people to Dropbox, and then we're recruiting people to work on this. Man, that was pure pain. We did manage to get a few people, but it was really, it required a very specific person to work
Yeah.
on
You come to Dropbox to work on distributed systems
it.
and you
Yes.
arrive and you're working on a CRM for
Oh my
recruits.
gosh. Exactly.
Cool. Let's dive in a little bit to the decision making process. You mentioned a couple items there. One was technical evaluation, but also just political changing people's minds. So we'll love to explore both facets. Maybe pick one that's most interesting to you to start with.
Yeah, maybe what I would, so maybe we could talk about the kind of technical evaluation, because
Yeah.
ultimately it's, so if you think about an applicant tracking system, its primary value accrues to the recruiting team.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, we were an internal team, and I would say we were embedded in recruiting. Obviously, we were in engineering, we were on the internal tools team, but we
Mhm.
were working directly with recruiting. And so they were our closest stakeholders. And the first thing that we had to do when we were doing the evaluation with other vendors was actually center them in the evaluation process. Even though we were engineers and we were the owners of the system, we had
Yeah.
to really make sure that we removed ourselves in some sense from the evaluation, because the technical aspects of an applicant tracking system are just not relevant. Yes, it needs to fit into our existing systems, it needs to pass certain security compliances, but really it was more about what's going to bring the most value to the recruiting team. And I
Mhm.
think importantly, we started when we started the evaluation of other vendors, we overly rotated on my interpretation of what recruiting would want, which was
Mhm.
like, as a product person, because we literally were comparing Greenhouse to Lever. And I don't know if you've ever used both of those products, but one of
At
them
Dropbox.
looks and, yeah, exactly. Okay, cool, great. One of them looks and feels it's actually made for the modern software, and the other one looks and feels like it's Oracle 2.0. Yeah, no offense to Greenhouse, but basically, and so I was like, okay, there's these sick visualizations in Lever, and it has these fun keyboard shortcuts, and it feels modern. And again, no offense to Lever, I love everyone who's still there, but okay, guys, it's a slam dunk. This is obviously Lever. It's so obvious. It's just, I couldn't even see myself using Greenhouse for even a minute. And so
Yeah.
we went down that path pretty far. And then at a certain point, the head of recruiting was like, no, you're just really not prioritizing my needs. And I called BS on the way that I was approaching the evaluation. And then ultimately, correctly pulled us out and said, actually, let's start from a more first principles. What are we actually trying to optimize for? And who are we trying to
Mhm.
optimize for? And so we actually took the evaluation pretty far down the path, and then we pulled it back and said, actually, no, we need to center the right user here. And when we did that math, honestly, Greenhouse was hands down the better solution for the business.
Mm.
Was it less usable? Yes. Was it uglier? Sure. But did it actually solve the long tail of recruiting problems that Lever didn't? Yes. Was the customizability of Lever enough? No. And so basically we went down the list and
Mhm.
ultimately ended up with Greenhouse because we properly centered the recruiting team's needs over our own as an engineering or product organization.
Interesting. You mentioned Lever at the end there is probably more flexible and from a
Mhm.
integration perspective or a modification perspective. What
Yeah.
was it about Greenhouse that won you over? It's
Yeah.
in one sense, it feels like having the flexibility and lever allows you to do exactly what you wanted, the long
Yeah.
solve the long tail of questions. Why did Greenhouse win over
It's
in that sense?
yeah, it's I would put it as the difference between kind of the theory of solving the problem and actually solving the problem.
Right.
So full flexibility, it's theoretically it can be made to do whatever you want, which is
Mhm.
useful if you're an engineer and you're going to go build something, you want to be able to go build it. But if you're a recruiting coordinator and you just want the scheduling system to just work in a specific way and it just works out of the box in a certain way, you will conform your workflow to that. And in some sense, by offering so much customizability and flexibility,
Mhm.
you overwhelm the user with choice. And it again appeals to an engineer brain, but to a recruiting coordinator who's used to conforming their workflow to the tools and not conforming the tools to their workflow, it
Yeah.
actually taking a slightly more rigid, you might say more opinionated, though I don't think either were particularly opinionated. A more rigid approach actually just worked better for recruiting. And it turns out that at the end of the day, they didn't really value the ability to alter their workflow. What they
Mhm.
valued was that they didn't need to do any setup and they're just conform to this thing. I don't really care if these two. It's yes, I would love to be able to customize the different things in certain ways, but it just doesn't matter. And then
Yeah.
ironically, actually levers design decisions. One of the big ones that recruiting hated was this idea that when you voted on someone, you had to say yes or no. You could not say maybe. You could like it was just
Mm.
impossible. And recruiting was like, but there's so many times where I actually just want to say, someone wants to say maybe, I don't know. I truly am agnostic on this candidate. And so what ended up happening was that small design decision that was we kept in lever, you could not put a neutral answer. Probably felt right at the time. But for Dropbox, as they matured, this decision sucks. I don't like this. And it was weirdly actually the one of the few things they were really opinionated about was the
Mhm.
read as a deal breaker to recruiting. And so I guess it's a case study in picking your battles and making sure that
Yeah.
you're really opinionated on the things that are correct to be opinionated about, and then you're flexible in the parts where you don't.
It's curious that you say recruiting, when we really dug into it, recruiting was open to conforming to an existing system, an existing process, when immediately prior to purchasing an ATS system, you
Yes.
had ultimate
It
flexibility.
had
You had a
full
team of engineers.
control. Yes.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, this almost in some ways highlights that maybe the ascribed value to the engineering and the flexibility and the build it yourself internally mentality, that value that was ascribed to that was misplaced by maybe the culture internally at Dropbox as opposed to what
Yeah.
was actually needed.
That's why I say this is a personally painful thing, right? Because you're like, well, did I just waste 2 years of my life? I think we provided value, but ultimately it was a pretty humbling experience as a product person, right? Where by providing that customizability, that kind of bespokeness, I probably ended up just delaying something that was inevitable.
Hmm.
And the way I really honestly feel about it was that actually while my team was there and we were really engaged, we provided a better outcome.
Hmm.
But that's a very tenuous position, right? It's
Yeah.
really dependent on us and our weird irrational passion for just making recruiting successful and efficient. And as soon as you remove the us from that equation, the software itself wasn't is actually maybe the way to think about it. I'm sorry, I'm having like a small epiphany. Is actually the value was us. It was our passion, it was our desire to push things forward. And in a way, we were building software, but the software was a vector for us to make recruiting truly an excellent function inside of
Hmm.
Dropbox. And as soon as you remove that magic part of it, then you're just left with just software. And
Yeah.
this wasn't the value. The value was a super reactive team that was super passionate about fixing bugs at the last minute and making the best candidate experience possible, all that stuff. And that was the magic. And once you remove the people from that equation, the magic kind of disappears, and then the product
Right.
is just it's fine.
In a lot of ways, I guess maybe to rephrase what you just said there, the software was a manifestation of the team's desire, like eagerness and willingness and desire to really do a good job. It
Yes.
probably that do a good job could be applied elsewhere and they would still have the same effect. But in some
or
ways, the
a much
software
greater effect.
much greater. Yeah. But in some ways, the software itself wasn't really a product. It was mainly just um, it
Yeah,
was
no,
an
I
art,
think
I
I
guess.
agree
Yeah.
with you. Yeah, it's the product. Put another way, it's the product needed to evolve over time. And so you needed the
Hmm.
humans to constantly evolve the product, right? If it was a
Yeah.
static problem set, then maybe that would be okay. And sometimes because the company was growing so fast and hitting unique problems, the software needed to evolve as the company evolved. It was a constantly
Hmm.
moving target. So it wasn't like we were just some secret services organization, but what we were was constantly responding to the short term urgencies of the business. So, a small example, we built this really sick feature for on-campus recruiting where basically you go on campus, you interview 200 people or 100 people or something like that. And we wanted to say, we built a really neat scheduling tool that allowed you to put in, we have 17 interviewers and there's these 300 slots, and then do the matching algorithm for all these candidates. And that
Hmm.
was cool, very bespoke. It was a magical experience for the interns because they could just click a button and magically get an interview in 1 second. That's really
Yeah.
cool. But it was very bespoke and it was a point in time and then it disappeared. And so in a
Yeah.
way, what we were doing was we were meeting these sequential moments and providing these really unique kind of great experiences. But then 6 months later, there's a new one that needs to come up and a new one
Hmm.
and a new one. And in a way, the like kind of thing that made the system special was the fact that it was constantly evolving. We were constantly
Mm.
evolving it. And then as soon as you remove the energy and the uniqueness and the kind of I don't know, that je ne sais quoi, then it's just software. And if you're just going to buy software, you might as well buy the software that's going to improve on its own because there's a team of 100 engineers working on it.
Yeah. It's curious. I feel I've completely diverging here in some ways. I've always thought about different company cultures that, excuse me, different company cultures that have resulted in really large cohorts of the people leaving and starting companies, right? If you look
Yeah.
at Palantir, Dropbox, there's a lot of us that have left to start companies. And then you would have expected maybe Airbnb to have as large of a cohort. But in a lot of ways, I don't really see that. I don't have actual data, but I know a lot fewer kind of founders that came from, or know of a lot fewer founders that came from an Airbnb culture.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it as you were just speaking, which is we built so many cool things in Dropbox that were not core to Dropbox that people literally just left and built
Mhm.
that for the public in probably a more productized way that then became companies in our quote unquote Dropbox mafia. And I wonder if that actually, you know, if that cultural aspect actually is part of the reason that there's so many founders from the Dropbox network or even
I think so.
yeah.
I think there's that element as a kind of culturally it was accepted and honestly cool to go and do just random stuff. And people still talk to me about how awesome Gateway was. And it's funny to me, okay, that was literally 10 years ago at this point, but
Yeah.
they remember it. And it was cool that we cared about candidates so much that we invested in this. And I think it was more symbolic, honestly, than anything, but we cared. And I think Dropbox was just filled with that. And then people who were
Yeah.
attracted to that kind of thing, those people, I think, differentially became entrepreneurs. There's the other part of it that I've heard, which I don't know if you've heard this part, but Dropbox basically created one of the richest, densest talent
Mhm.
pools of a company that did not become $100 million company. And so instead of everyone being super rich and retiring or whatever, they collected and knew each other and then they made, good money. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a life changing outcome for them. And so as
Mhm.
you're in, at least that's how I felt about it. Whereas, oh man, this thing's going to be $100 billion plus business. I'm here for that. And then it grew, but it didn't grow astronomically. And
Mhm.
so instead of being I can go retire. It's like more, yep, I'm ready to do my next thing. And that next thing is going to be with these really awesome people that I know. And I feel some amount of that happened, at
Yeah.
least to my cohort at Dropbox. And so we're all out here striving to try to go
I
retire
think
on a beach or something.
I think a lot of us would never retire on a beach. We just
That's also
wouldn't do
true.
that.
I say that knowing full well that I would
Yeah.
never
But
actually do that.
I do think that in some ways we're very, fortunate to now have the opportunity to go start something and not start something because we out of necessity, but
Yeah.
start something because we want to and have the cushion to do that. So I'm very thankful for that, I'll say. Cool. Maybe Just to wrap up today's conversation, I know we touched on a lot of different topics, and today we actually touched on something that I don't think we've touched on in previous podcast recordings, which is centering the actual user, and in this case, recruiting when evaluating a build versus buy. But one thing we always wrap up with is we ask the guests, what is something that you're excited that you've been working on, both personal or professional, you can choose, that you would like to share with the audience?
Hmm. I could go shill mode or I could go not shill mode, but I'll do shill mode for 2 seconds because it's just
Okay.
happened. So on Tuesday, we had a big product launch where we basically announced the V.Next of our product, which is really just all about improving the core usability. And the reason I mention it is because it's the cleanest expression of what we're trying to build, which is that
Hmm.
turn your billing system into something that helps your business grow faster, not just merely automates like revenue accounting flows. And
Hmm.
so it's the kind of purest expression. I also spent, I don't even want to say how much time writing every word of copy on that website. Very personally proud of that. And it's also our first product launch in the 5 years of this business. So that's been great. On the non shilling side, I would say, I think for me, personally, I think something that I've been working a lot on is so I have two young kids, a 5 year
Hmm.
old and 2 year old. And a lot of what I've been focused on is how to run a fast growing business at the same time that I have a sane relationship with my children. And
Yeah.
so a lot of what I've been personally proud of is creating a work life balance in that part of my life and making sure that
Hmm.
I'm always home by 5:30 and doing that kind of thing. And so personally, I feel have invested a lot over the past 6 months, especially as I stepped into the CEO role and making sure that I have that balance and trying to find that balance. And so a lot of it's not a specific thing I'm building or whatever, but it is something that I'm personally proud of and something I take a lot of effort into because I think it's really easy to get absorbed by small startups. And I think that's all well and good. I do think it's also important to remember that actually you're building for someone. And in this case, I'm building for my family and my kids.
Yeah.
If I'm not at home, then what the heck was the point?
You're working on building space in your life for all the other important
100%.
things. And last question here to wrap it up is, share a product that you've recently purchased. Either you loved it or you would never buy it again, with the audience so that they can know what that is.
Oh man. Okay. I would say uh OpenAI or Anthropic Claude subscription. I
Okay.
think I have completely changed how I do my writing workflows. I write a lot. And so what we've done internally is we basically created a mini bot of my voice where it basically pre-trains and rags in a bunch of my previous written stuff. And so that subscription just allows me to really quickly generate a lot of thoughts and then refine the heck out of them. And so I would say that to me has been honestly, it's one of the what I realized is that LLM AI stuff, it requires a bit of I don't think we figured out the workflows for using them
Yeah.
yet. But in the places where I have taken the time to mutate my workflow against the new technology, the results have been crazy. Actually, I just did a blog post and I have an editor and I sent it to my editor and then they sent me back a blog post. I'm like, oh wow, I always had to redline and go through it. I'm like, wow, there's very few changes I would make in this. You're getting really good. I didn't edit this.
Yeah.
I just used the trained OpenAI LLM. Oh God. Either I'm becoming banal and basic internet slop, or optimistically, we've done a good job in fine tuning that thing. That's been one of the more subtle, not subtle things for me.
Awesome. Well, Scott, it's been a pleasure catching up with you and really loved learning more about your experience at Dropbox building Gateway, learning more about Metronome. Metronome is one of the information's 50 most promising startups. Go
Oh
check them out.
God.
I need to get the plug in there. And yeah, I appreciate you jumping on the show today.
I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great weekend and hope to meet up in person sometime soon.
I would love that. Thank you.
All right. See ya.
Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.